Since about the middle of April, the news media has been gripped with reports from around the United States of increasing mobilization by students on university and college campuses about the war in Gaza, and then also counter protests and counter movements and responses by university administrators. Some of this actually goes back a bit further, even into 2023. And, I've been studying various aspects of contentious politics and social movements for almost 30 years. And about 10 years ago, I actually used to teach a class for undergraduates that parsed and analyzed different varieties of student protest and campus activism. So I thought a lot of the ideas that I'm pretty familiar with could be used to make sense of what's going on campuses around the United States, but they seem to be conspicuously absent from most of the popular discourse. So I wanted to just think a little bit about this and share those thoughts in this video about how we might make sense of what's going on and what's interesting or important or informative about the protests, and also what ideas about social movements and contentious politics can bring to making sense of these protests. And so there are three main areas that I'd like to focus in on. The first is sort of claims and targets, for lack of a better term. When we think about claims and targets in the social movement context, the claims are what protesters actually articulate for their demands or their assertion of what they want their interlocutor to do. And the target is the interlocutor, who you're protesting against, who you're mobilizing against. And so in these cases, with the students constructing these various encampments or engaged in different protests are those making the claims. The targets are their universities. Now, let me talk first about targets, because part of the issue is, why do you target a university when what you're really protesting about is the policy or behavior of a government in another country? Right? What can a university administrator or academic or other leader possibly do to change the behavior of the Israeli government? Not much, right? So why target the university? Eventually, if you keep protesting against your own university in futility, you're just not going to get very far, and you'll end up alienating possible supporters. Now, this struck me a long time ago first, about 20 years ago, a little more than 20 years ago, when I was writing up a dissertation on workers' protests in Chinese cities. And I was sitting in Berkeley, actually doing that. And at that time, there were large protests in Berkeley against the US involvement in Iraq, right? The beginning and sort of just past the beginning stages of the Second Iraq War. And it occurred to me that some of these protests became quite large, and there was quite a bit of confrontation between some of the protesters and university authorities and local police. I thought, well, what is the utility of protesting against the UC Berkeley administration to try to get a change in U.S. government policy? Why do that? And the idea occurred to me that this is a hidden target, right? The overt target is the university. The hidden target is the U.S. government. Right? So they don't actually expect that the university is going to change the behavior of the U.S. government, but they want to have this protest against the university or confront the university in some way to draw attention to what they want changed, so they might be able to change the behavior of the U.S. government. Now, in some cities in China, the workers seem to be doing the same thing. For example, in northeastern China, workers knew that city governments couldn't really do much to fix their problem when they faced unemployment or deprivation. Those city governments just didn't have the resources. And they were probably actually sympathetic to the workers in some ways, but they couldn't do much about it. Yet it was politically anathema, or at least not feasible, for workers to target the central government directly, who might have actually been able to do something. So the local government served as a hidden target. And that's what I think is really going on now as well. Students have realized that their universities are kind of overt targets, and the hidden target is actually the US government or the Israeli government, right? They actually want change from somebody else that has very little to do directly with the university that is their overt target. And that's fine as a strategy, except that eventually it's difficult to sustain, right? It becomes difficult to sustain support and to continue to get people attracted to that idea of protest against an overt target that's quite clearly different from the hidden target. And eventually people start to say, well, why aren't you just protesting against the hidden target directly? And so, how to get around this, right? How to find a way to sustain the protest and then continue to attract more supporters. And this is where I think there's been innovation around claims. If you look at the beginning phases of some of these recent protests, the claims were kind of abstract or general. They weren't as focused. More recently, they've focused around this idea of divestment or changing the way that universities invest their endowments and other resources, or curtailing some kinds of academic or other exchanges with Israel or with others, or not participating in certain government programs. There's various kinds of claims, but mostly around this divestment idea. That's an interesting and I think savvy tactical move. Because what that does is it actually means that the university as target is meaningful, right? The university as target is no longer just this kind of impotent overt target where the hidden target lies behind, but now they're actually asking the university to do something. And so that's pretty savvy in terms of attracting support and sustaining the protest. It's problematic, though, however, in two ways, potentially. One is that it's difficult to define exactly what they want. And if they don't do that, if they can't nail down exactly what they expect and make sure that those things are objectives on which the university may actually be able to deliver, ultimately they're not going to get very far, right? If they demand overall divestment of everything from anything having to do in any way with Israel, that won't get them very far, most likely. And I think you can look no further, for example, than to the protests in recent years around divestment from anything having to do with fossil fuels. Right? Easier said than done, even when the university is sympathetic, which in this case I don't think they are nearly as sympathetic to that idea, most universities. So unlikely to actually achieve results unless they can really focus it and focus it in a very thoughtful and careful way around things that could actually be achieved. The second risk is that when you make that targeting of the local or overt target much more sharp and specific, that's much more likely to compel or force a response. And the response may not always be the kind of response that the students are probably hoping for, right? They may not always get concessions. And so I think that's an aspect of the sort of the claim making and also targeting that is fairly obvious, but it's not necessarily thought about systematically, or at least it talked about systematically in a lot of the discourse. I think it's worth doing that. Let's move now to kind of responses. And here I really thought that there was a useful way to deploy insights that I got from that earlier research 25 years ago now on Chinese workers' protests. When I did that, I looked at sort of how do city governments respond to workers when they do protest, and I found three responses. One was a kind of bargaining response, right, where the cities would try to pay workers some of what they maybe wanted, or at least give them some sort of benefit, usually cash benefit or other kind of monetary benefit, in exchange for a promise to stop protesting. And kind of a bargaining dynamic took hold. Eventually, a Nash bargaining solution could be agreed upon where both sides felt that they were better off for the bargain than not, and the workers would go home. A second kind of response is what I called a signaling response, where city governments would adopt a stance that was very repressive, right? That they would come out sort of strongly repressive, repress the protest, often very violently, right at the beginning, in order to try to send a signal. That there was no chance of achieving anything through a protest, that repression was what was going to follow, and actually that it was in workers' best interest to stay home and not engage in these kind of protests. And that was another type of response. The third type of response was do nothing, essentially try to ignore the protest or just let it continue until maybe it might peter out, or attention might actually be attracted from higher level authorities that could do something about the underlying issues that were motivating the protest. And we could chart these as being more common in different types of cities. So cities that had lots of resources, lots of money, lots of other kinds of political capital and resources would usually go for the bargaining response, right? That it was worth it to them to bargain. They could afford to make payments to workers, and they could afford the risk from that strategy, which is that other workers would see, well, these guys got payoff from the government. Why don't we go out and protest? We could get the same or even better payoff. And if you don't give every round of workers protesting a payoff, then you're going to have real trouble. So it sort of spirals into these more and more and more payoffs. But if you have lots of resources, you can afford that. It's worth it because it keeps the peace, it calms everything down, and you don't have to worry too much about it. The repression response is actually almost always much more costly in that round that you repress than bargaining would have been, right? It's much harder and more expensive usually to repress a protest strongly than it is just to pay off all the protesters, right? But sending that strong signal and bearing that cost is also a huge political risk of repression in that if it failed repression is the worst thing that could possibly happen from the point of view of the government. Or if people really get injured badly or there's lots of violence involved, that doesn't look good at the very least. It can carry political costs and political consequences. But if it's successful, you deter all those subsequent rounds of protesters, right? You avoid having to engage in multiple rounds of either repression or bargaining. And so the signaling response can be useful when you have less resources, right? When you're afraid that you're not going to be able to afford all those rounds of payoffs that are probably going to happen if you engage in bargaining. But you have enough resources and enough sort of security and political capital to do one really hard round of repression, or at least one, maybe two rounds. And then if you really have no resources or very limited resources, and you can't really do anything about this, then you go for the do nothing response. And we'd see cities that were poorer or worse off go for that. Now, if we look at the universities, I would make reference to 3 universities where I've been over my career at different points. Berkeley, University of Texas at Austin, and Northwestern University. And in the next video, I'll talk a little bit more about the dynamics of their responses.